Let's move on to adding some JavaScript to our project, where we're really going to bring our project to life. To do this, we're going to create a script section down at the very bottom. So if we scroll to the end of our index.html, just above the closing body tag, we can insert our JavaScript inside of the script elements. This will have an opening and closing tag, and all of our code will go between this section. So let's think about what we want to do here. We have the bill section up at the top, and the user is going to add a value inside of here. So once this is done, we want to run some code to update all of the values. To do this, we can create a function which is going to be responsible for all of these changes. We do this with the function keyword, followed by a name which we want to give to this function. We could also pass in certain arguments between these brackets if we wanted to, and we'll take a look at how to do this later on in this project. For now, though, we need to understand that everything which we add in between these curly braces will be ran each time we call this update function. So how do we actually call this update function? Well, there's multiple ways we can do this. As an example, we can do this when an element has been clicked. Let's scroll up to our bill section. If we locate our input, as an attribute, we can listen for an event. An event is when something happens, such as an element is clicked or an input is updated, and this will then allow us to call our function. As an example, we're going to listen out for a click, so we can use onClick. Inside of the quotations, we add the code which we want to run. In our case, we want to call the update function, followed by the brackets, just like this. If we save this and reload the browser, when we click on this input, we don't see anything happen just yet. This is because we don't have any code between these curly braces. We can check this is working by doing a console log, which is going to output a message to the console. Let's just say function called. Save our file. If we reload the browser, we can now head into the developer tools. We do this with right click and inspect. Click on the console tab. Since we're listening to a click event, we now want to click this input just here. This then outputs the text of function called, so our function is now being called correctly. Let's also keep this open for later and shrink the browser down. However, though, calling this function when this is clicked on is not a good use case. We actually want to run this function each time the user inputs anything inside of this input field. To do this, we can scroll back up to our input and change the type to be onInput. So let's change this. Rather than onClick, we need onInput. Reload the browser. Now each time we type a number inside of this field, we see that our function has now been called 3 times. However, though, for this function, we want to make it a little bit more useful rather than just simply logging some text to the console. Instead, what we want to do is to grab the value of our bill, the percentage from our slider, and also the number of people which the bill is being split between. To do this, we can access the values which have been input into any of these fields. First of all, we select the full document, which is the web page. We can then narrow this down to select a single element. One of the ways we can grab this is to select this by the element's ID. So the first one we want to grab is the value of this bill. If we scroll up to the bill, this has the value of your bill. So we can make use of this. We say document, and then we can grab an element by the ID and add in the value of your bill. Now we have access to this particular element. We can now store this inside of a variable. We can create a variable with the let keyword and then give this a name such as bill. This will now store the value of everything on the right hand side to this value called bill. If we want to check this is working, we can also do a new console log, passing in the value of bill. And this will be called each time we add something to our input. If we take a look at the console, we see the value of the actual input element with the type of number. However, what we want for our tip calculator is to actually grab the contents which the user inputs. And we can do this with .value. Let's try this again by reloading, enter a value. And now the actual value entered by the user will now be stored in this bill variable. So now we know how to do this, we can also grab the tip percent and also the split. So let's copy and paste this in 2 more times. The second one is the tip percent. We need to also grab an ID, so let's take a look for this. The first range input has the ID of tip input. So copy this, paste this in. And the third one is going to be for the split. And this has an ID of split input. Just before we move on, let's log all 3 of these values and check they are working. The next one is the tip percent and also the split. Reload the browser. Let's go for the value of 67. So we see the value of 67, then we have the value of the tip, which is currently 0, and then the split, which is 1 person. Just as a quick tip too, when console logging multiple values, we can also wrap these in the curly braces to turn these into an object, and these will be a lot more easier to read. So add a value. This will then output the property name along with the value to make it much more readable in the console. This now means we're capturing all of our user inputs and we can work with these values very soon. However, you will notice if we work with the range inputs that none of the values are updated in the console. This is because we are only calling this update function each time the user inputs something to this bill. However, for our use case, it would be a lot more practical if this function was updated when the user clicked on any of these inputs. So to do this, let's remove the onInput event handler. And instead we can place this on the main wrapper. This main section is wrapping all of our inputs. So now if we save this, refresh the browser, and now each time one of our inputs has been updated, this will now call our function. We see the tip percentage has been increased and also the split is now between 3 people. This means our update function is now being called for all 3 inputs, but we can also improve on this by removing our JavaScript and also separating this from the HTML. The way we can do this, if we set an ID, let's go for container, we can now keep this as pure HTML and only have our JavaScript in the script section below. So first, let's create a reference to this main wrapper. We do this just as above with document.getElementById. The ID name, which we just placed in, is container. And we can store this in a variable called container. So now we have our container. We want to reintroduce our onInput event handler. We can do this with add event listener. And this is going to take in 2 values. The first value is the type of event we want to listen for. Just like before, we can use things such as click or input, and then separated by a comma, the name of the function which we want to call. And in our case, this is update. Let's save this file and check this is working okay. When we click on the bill, this is updated. If we increase the tip, this is also updated too. And finally, the split value. This now leaves our function with access to all of the information which we need. And next we're going to use all of these values to create our tip calculations and then display them in the user interface.